Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of webinars with NUITEQ Snowflake. Tonight, Danielle Macklin will be speaking to process versus product in education. So Danielle will be presenting. If you have any questions, please pop your questions into the chat function, and we will try to look at them and answer them as we go along. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Jack. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for being here. As Jack was saying, we are going to talk today about process-oriented learning, or process over product. So as we go through, I've, of course, have created a Snowflake lesson activity to help explain some of the differences between product-oriented learning and process-oriented learning. And then we'll talk about how Snowflake can be used to help create process-oriented learning objectives in your own classroom. So again, as we're going through, if you have any questions, go ahead and place them in the chat. And I'm hoping that I can articulate this in a way that doesn't make it seem like one is better than the other, because with everything in education, there are multiple different benefits to all of the different ways in which students can learn and ways that students can be assessed on their learning. And when we look at process over product, we're not saying that process is the only way and that your whole style of teaching and the whole pedagogy that you use should be geared toward that, and you should just abandon all product-oriented learning. Instead, this is just to explain the differences between the two and then some of the benefits of using a process-oriented learning model. So as we go through, with product-oriented learning, we often look at that as students are going to reach a particular outcome. So there's an objective that they are going to reach, and it often involves the creation of some form of an artifact. And when I say artifact, this refers to things like test results. So product-oriented would be having a formal assessment at the end of a unit, making sure that students have learned the objectives and the standards, and you're assessing their knowledge of that. It could also be things like student-written essays, student-created presentations or models, but the focus of a product-oriented model is there is something at the end that is going to demonstrate students' learning and their understanding. Product-oriented learning also focuses on the what that has been learned. So this is the standards, this is the objective, this is what skills or what content did you try to have students learn, and did they learn it? Are they able to demonstrate that knowledge? With product-oriented learning, it is static, it's fixed. It oftentimes will involve the one and done type activities. So when I say one and done, that tends to refer to those very short-term assignments or worksheets. It's a quick assessment of students' learning and of their knowledge. On the other end of that, we have our process-oriented learning. And with process-oriented learning, this is when you look for the steps in achieving a goal. So it's less about what is the end result and how did the student actually get to that result. So that how the learning happens. When we talk about the how the learning happens, we're talking about pedagogy, we're talking about teaching styles, and we're also talking about student learning styles. So in the process, this is where you're going to see a lot of that scaffolding and the steps that students take in order to achieve their goals at the end. With process-oriented learning, it's very fluid, it's very dynamic. It is when you're going to see things like students participating in Genius Hours or Makerspace. It's also tends to be geared more towards project-based learning. And so we've done some sessions on project-based learning in the past. with the goal being students learn new content and learn new skills through inquiry and discovery, and the process of creating something along the way. With process-oriented learning and process-oriented learning objectives, it is very much focused on the student and on how the student is learning, and takes into consideration a lot of the brain science behind learning, and helps students become aware of their own learning as well, so that they can think about how they've learned new concepts or new content. Process-oriented learning also allows for positive failure, which I know seems kind of contradictory, but with failure, students learn things. So when something doesn't work, you learn, okay, well, that way didn't work, so let me try it this way instead. So you see this a lot, especially in STEM education, where you try something once, it didn't work out, you go back, you redesign, you retest, you rehypothesize, and create something different and learn along the way of creating that. So having those opportunities for failure is never a bad thing. It allows students to develop some grit and make their way closer toward achieving that final goal. And along the way, they're learning lots of skill sets. So with process-oriented learning, there's a lot of benefits for process-oriented learning. Process-oriented learning is a student-centered approach. So students are at the front and center of the learning, and the teacher has a role more of a facilitator. It's kind of that idea of the sage on the stage versus the guide on the side. And with the teacher being the facilitator, they're going to scaffold the student learning process. So it might be presenting students with inquiry-based questions to help guide them along with their learning. It might be in helping students realize new ideas, helping students make those connections, and giving them opportunities to test different theories. So it's very much focused on the students driving forward their learning, and the teacher being there to provide those opportunities for support without necessarily giving them that direct instruction. Another benefit with process-oriented learning is students take over much of the ownership of learning and of metacognition, or of thinking about their own learning. This is where we see a lot of student choice and student voice in process-oriented learning. So providing them with opportunities to find the best pathways that meet their own needs and their own interests and activate their own schema. So having that ownership, students are going to become more invested in the learning process because it feels more applicable to their own life and to their own learning. Having that ownership is very empowering. I'm sure many teachers have always had those, or have had those moments of students asking, well, why do I need to learn this? What am I ever going to use this for? I got that all the time when I was teaching my middle schoolers. How come we have to learn this social studies? How come we have to learn this? But with a process-oriented approach, students can make those connections to their own lives and to things that are relevant to them, to their own experiences. And then by making those connections, they can see how that why do I have to learn is relevant. So they can better understand not just the content and the concepts and the skills, but how it's connected to the real world and to their own learning. Also, with process-oriented learning, we have the benefit of students gaining processing skills. When we talk about those processing skills, we talk about those 6 C's of education. Things like thinking critically, communicating, working collaboratively, developing creativity and connectivity, and then of course embracing culture. So having those 6 C skills, that's a mouthful, having those 6 C skills are going to help students in the long term of their education, because they're developing skills that are not just going to be important for their time in a school setting, but for their time in the real world. And as they grow and become adults and functioning members of society, we want our students, we want our citizens to be critical thinkers. We want them to be able to work in collaborative settings where they might be working with other, in the case of school, other students, but in the real world, they might be working with a team of other employees. And they need to have good communication skills to have those abilities to work collaboratively. And with process-oriented learning, since it is so student-focused and centered, and students are the ones driving forward that instruction, it really challenges them to start adopting some of those process skills. And then in doing that, it will help them acquire, interpret, and apply some new knowledge to their skills. So lots to cover with process-oriented learning. So let's talk a little bit about how you can use some of the tools in Snowflake to help drive forward that process-oriented learning model. So a few different ways that we can use Snowflake for process-oriented learning. So starting first, just like I'm showing here, is I'm using a list. And I'm going to go kind of back and forth between showing this display and talking about the items on this PDF. So as we go through, when we talk about lists, I'll open up a list to share. In Snowflake, you have the ability to group together lesson activities into a list so that students can play those lists in a sequential order, or so they can use them as a way to scaffold and build upon new skills. So for example, here's a list with just 2 lesson activities, but I could build it out to include many more, just like I have here on a activity about Jupiter. And in this list, I can help scaffold the learning for my students so that it is continuously building upon new skills and new learning. So with my math list, as an example, I can incorporate a video that might teach an introductory skill for graphing ordered pairs. And then my students could watch the video, complete the list lesson activity, and then I could have next a PDF that might explain a more challenging concept related to that same skill set. So within my list, I have that process of students are completing tasks and challenges that are going to continuously build upon their previous knowledge and understanding. And it's about the learning along the way to get to that end result. So list is one way. Open up our PDF again. The next way is by using polls. And with polls, you have the opportunity for that real-time student response system. So with polls, you can ask a variety of questions, but it's also a really great way for students to share with their class, share with their teacher, some reflections of their own learning. So just to share a little anecdote from when I was teaching, I did a Genius Hour with my 8th grade students for an entire academic quarter. And I told the students that they can spend, we had 1 day a week devoted just for that. And it did not have to be about anything related to social studies. It could be anything that they were interested in, that they wanted to learn more about, but they had to share along the way as they were learning. And every week at the start of our Genius Hour, we would have a moment of reflection on how their project was going or how their new skill was taking shape. I had students who had Genius Hour projects where they wanted to learn how to do a backflip. So it was all about how are we going to achieve that? I had a student who wanted to learn sign language, and she was focused on how am I going to learn this skill? I had students who wanted to create things. One student who wanted to learn how to do some of those string braided bracelets, and other students who one student wanted to learn how to bake a cake. And so it was a lot of different things that were not necessarily in any way related to what I had taught them in social studies, but it was a way for them to take ownership over something that they were interested in learning. And all I gave them was time and any support that they needed, and that was pretty much it. So as my students were going through and spending the time in class, trying to develop those Genius Hour projects or presentations, like I said, we had our reflections with polls, and I would open up poll. I might need to make this a little tinier so you can see the whole screen. I would open up poll on my panel, and I would have a lesson activity opened with different guiding questions about, we called it their passion project. And then my students would use poll to respond. And this was a way for my students to reflect on how they were learning along the way. What was working, what wasn't working, where were they stuck, where were they celebrating the things they did achieve. So my students could respond, and it gave them that space where they could just share with the class, what's going on with my project, what do I need to focus more on, and what's been hard, what's been working out great. I think this particular question was, what will be the most challenging, or what has been the most challenging. So my students had a chance to think about, okay, now that I've created this idea, what's going to maybe be a difficult moment getting to that goal. So giving them that opportunity allowed them to think a lot about, how am I going to get there? So the process of how am I going to get to what I want to achieve. So with process-oriented learning, it's a lot of the journey over the destination. And then lastly, we can use process-oriented learning with student-created lesson activities. So one of the things I really love about having Snowflake available on a web-based platform with Snow.live is we have an opportunity for students to have their own account where they can create their own lesson activities. So what better way for students to demonstrate what they have learned than by sharing that, than creating something. So moving from being just a consumer of content to the creator of content. So with all of our lesson activity templates, students can create different lesson activities that share what they have been learning or what skills they've acquired. And then those lesson activities can be shared with their teacher in a group. So the good thing with that is students cannot publish to the Snowflake community, but they can share their lesson activities directly into a group that is facilitated by their teacher. And then within that group, those lesson activities can either be shared with all members of the group, or the teacher can look at the lesson activity and then choose to have the student go back and make edits and reflections, and perhaps change parts of the lesson to reshare back into that group. So having student-created lesson activities is going to allow students to show their own learning process as well. Oh, and there's our whole picture again as I go back. So with process-oriented learning, we do see a lot of that focus shifting on just assessing students on what they have learned to helping students figure out how they got to that learning in the beginning. So what steps did they take to achieve it? How did they go from learning just a little bit of something to learning much more about that particular subject, or much more about the skills necessary within that content. So it's a lot to take in, going from product where you're assessing a final outcome to process where you're facilitating the learning as a pathway toward that end result. So are there any questions about anything that we have covered today in our webinar? Very educational theory today.
So no questions, it seems. So anything else from you?
Nothing from me. I do want to thank everyone who has joined us over the last few months. And we are going to be taking a break for summer. So over the summer break, hopefully everyone will enjoy some of the holiday. We would love to hear from you, ideas that you might have about future webinar topics. So as always, you can email Jack with those ideas. If there's anything that you would like more information on, anything that we can share with you on Snowflake, please let us know, because we would love to make sure that our webinars are meeting some of your needs as well.
So yeah, again, my email is jr@nuitec.com. So for Jack Reed, jr@nuitec.com. Feel free to email me ideas that you might have of things that you'd like to see for the upcoming series that we'll do next, starting next school year. And we'll look into adding things in as we can. And I hope everyone has a wonderful summer and enjoys some time away from office and away from schools and away from work. And vamos para la playa. So let's go to the beach and have some fun. So thank you very much for joining for the past year. And we look forward to seeing you next academic year, which would be in September. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Jack. Bye, everyone.
Ciao.